Finnigan is the Associate Professor of Education Policy at the University of Rochester, and Alan Daly is Professor and Chair of the Department of Education Studies at the University of California in San Diego. A lot of what they're going to be talking about during this presentation is included in their wonderful book, which is really a collection of studies and essays about using research evidence in education, and I really urge you to take a look at, but you'll get some great highlights during the presentation today.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Kara.
I'm Alan, in case that wasn't clear.
In case you didn't know. We have different styles in dress, but this is all coming together. Our minds come together in this presentation, and we also have a number of other people who have helped us along the way. We are so grateful to the WT Grant Foundation because so much of our own thinking has changed and evolved through their support of our work and their support of this broader area of research in terms of creating the learning community that Vivian mentioned.
We'd also like to thank a number of other friends that came out to join us today, so we're really appreciative about that. And just on a sort of a style note, you'll know that it's only because I'm from San Diego that I can legitimately wear a scarf when it's 70 degrees outside. So just to be clear. But we're also deeply appreciative to Maria and the team here at CEP. We're also very appreciative from AYPF, who have been also equally supportive of our work, and our friend Esther, who's been blogging at the Albert Shanker Institute around the social side of reform. So there's many people to thank, and we're deeply appreciative. We're really the sum of our parts, and we're appreciative that you're here.
One reminder is that this is an edited book, and so we have a number of people who have contributed, and what we're talking about today brings all of those themes across the chapters together.
And it's so much nicer not to have our moms bragging about our book, to have somebody else do it. So we're also really super thankful to the people that participated. It really was a community of learners that brought all of this together. So we're very appreciative to all of them.
All right. So now we will begin. Like Vivian, we're trying to do a little bit different from your typical academic presentation. So we have a number of images that we're going to share with you, and I'm sure some of them will stick, and it'll be interesting to see which ones do. This one might not be the one that sticks, but we wanted to orient you today to what the problem is that we're sitting within this context, this policy context, that creates importance around thinking about how research evidence is used at different levels of the system. So the first is all the challenges that are in the educational system, and some of this has to do with Common Core, but we've been leading up to this for a long time, and so people within the system itself feel a lot of pressure. The pressure is around changing their practices and aligning to new types of ways of learning and thinking, but also pressure to report back on how people are doing in the system. There's also different perspectives on what research evidence is and its value. And there's a gap as a result between knowledge development and knowledge utilization. And that's resulted in a sort of a misalignment between what we have in the system that is valued and what we have that's enacted. Okay, so in the book there are three major themes, and these go along with them. The first one is around translational issues around evidence. The second one is around the interconnectedness that Vivian was talking about of the system that we operate within. And the third is around what we call evidence as learning, which again Vivian alluded to as well. So the first one is around translation. What do we mean by that? So people define evidence differently. There are issues around how it is translated to different groups. And there's also issues around the usability, as Vivian was alluding to earlier. In part, there's a lot of knowledge within systems, but there's pressure from outside. So there's a lack of ability to kind of cross over into different sectors to see what's available to learn from. So this creates a disconnect between a lot of the knowledge that's in the system and whether it makes its way into different levels of the system, whether it's the classroom, district level, or for policymakers.
And so you've heard the word system a lot this morning. So it's something that's really important. And that's actually a paradigm shift for a lot of people. Because for a long time, we've thought about the discrete elements and improving discrete elements as opposed to thinking about the interdependent and interconnected nature of the work, right? So we work on improving schools, and while that's important, we know that schools sit inside this larger district system that can actually be quite consequential to the improvement efforts that school is trying to make. So we want to think about this use of research evidence as a systemic issue, or something that really has to be including a wide variety of actors. And so we sort of think about this. You may have seen this sort of famous picture by Edison. And Edison is standing there and he's sort of handing the light bulb off to the future. And while we know that that's a really important thing, the light bulb is a really critical thing, or else you couldn't see all of us here, we also know that the interconnected system of grids and power plants, those are the things that enable all of us to have light. So sometimes we get very caught up in the thing and we forget about the system. And what we're arguing here in this work, and what you can really see across all of these chapters, is we've got to be mindful about the work that we're doing as well as the system in which that resides. But it's not just the system, as you heard Vivian and others say. It's the quality of relationships and connectedness we have within that system. So for example, in some of our work and some of the work in the book, it suggests that people are likely to take up ideas from those with whom they have a really strong emotional connection, even if those ideas rationally don't make sense. You remember some of this from your teenage years, I'm sure. And so this idea about our BFFs being really influential on us is an important one to keep in mind. And in social systems, we have connections to people. And some we have deeper quality of ties with those people. And it's through those deeper quality ties that information moves and gets connected. But there's also another kind of actor that exists in these systems. And we call these actors research mediators. They're kind of like a broker. So I'm going to talk you through what that looks like through using something from California. So this is San Francisco from about 30,000 feet. And you can see San Francisco is surrounded by water on three sides. And so in a way, we can imagine that this is not so different than some people in organizations, that they're kind of disconnected or isolated in some way. And when you're disconnected or isolated, you need to be connected, right? And so you start to build bridges. And these bridges represent an opportunity to have otherwise disconnected people be connected, right? So then we build something that looks like this. And on this, you could see the cars are moving, which is not always the case. You can see the cars are moving. And this represents the flow of information and ideas between otherwise disconnected people, right? It forms a connection, a bridge. But sometimes that bridge can get really crowded. It can get crowded with unnecessary ideas, pressures from the system, too much input. And at other times, it can get filtered, right? That we can't always see where we're going to go, that it gets clouded. The same happens in people systems. And let's illustrate this using some of our work here. And so this is the closest you're going to get today to charts and graphs from academics. So apologies, this is pretty close. Let me just sort of walk you through what you're looking at here. So this is a social network. It's a sociogram. And it's a sociogram of a large urban school districts. Let me tell you what the components are here. Each one of these dots, we call them nodes. Each one of these dots or nodes represents a person in this particular system. These people are in formal leadership roles. So if you're in this group right here in the middle, you work in the central office. Okay, so you're like director, superintendent, curriculum kinds of folks. If you're out here in this beautiful rainbow of colors, you are a principal, right? So each one of these clusters represents a group of principals. This particular district is organized by zones and areas. And each one of those zones and areas has one of these triangles here. And those triangles represent somebody from the district office, like an area superintendent, okay? So this forms a very nice system. And we can learn some stuff about this particular system through the lens of brokers or bridges. So, for example, these area superintendents right here have the responsibility for connecting from the central office to the principals, right? In a way, they're like connecting San Francisco to Oakland, okay? And so what you see here is you see that some of these nodes, some of these triangles are bigger than other triangles. And these are sized by the kind of brokerage roles they play in the system. In other words, how much actual connecting do they do? So one thing that we could see right off the bat is that there are some area superintendents that do a lot of connecting and others that don't do very much. The other thing that you might notice in this system is that there are a bunch of lines here. And those lines represent the movement of research expertise. So who do you turn to get expertise from research? And if we look at these clusters, we can see that not all clusters are equal, right? In some, there's very little exchange around this research expertise. In others, there's much more. We can also see that, remember I told you that the nodes are sized by the amount of brokerage or connecting that they're doing? And we would expect that people in formal roles should be doing more of this. We can also see some of the principals here that actually do quite a number of brokering. So what that represents is a difference between the formal system in which these area superintendents are supposed to be doing this kind of activity and the informal system in which the principals themselves are connecting and moving information. So in essence, what we have at the same time is we have a formal system that's operating, that's codified, written down. People can look at org charts and understand what's happening. But we also have an informal series of interactions that are happening. And in many cases, it's those informal interactions that are really driving change and improvement within a system. And this is within a district system. But you heard Vivian talk earlier that there's actually these intermediaries that play brokering roles, research mediating roles between districts and themselves, between policymakers, districts, and foundations, any number of different combinations. So I really think, and the work would show up, I think, in our book, that we are really in an age of the rise of the intermediary organization. They're playing really important roles, like CEP, for example, is playing a really important role in convening us all together.
So Vivian gave such a nice story of what we have been thinking about in terms of evidence as learning, because so much of the time we talk about things, what are the things that people are looking at, but it's really the process of looking at those things that matters. And as has already been mentioned, there's a trusting relationship that has to exist if you're coming together to make sense of data. And in the current accountability context, that's harder to have happen. So in many of the districts we do our own work in, we see people who are vulnerable to say if they don't understand what the data is suggesting or where the root cause of the problems are, and so they rely on very superficial types of information and move forward with solutions without that kind of a process.
I think on this point, one thing to mention that I didn't is that in that network map that you saw from Karen and I's work, we actually take that data and feed it back into the system, right? So we're not interested in doing what typical people do, which is to come and gather a bunch of stuff and then disappear to our offices. We want to really use that data to help drive the work of the district, just as the story about Paul was told.
So if you think about that, then you're understanding evidence in a different way. You're thinking about the process of making sense of data or making sense of the different types of research that's available. And people use experience as a different type of evidence. That all can be mixed into the process of learning that happens. And one of the things that we build upon in our work is this idea of the single loop versus double loop learning. The way to think about this is that in single loop learning, you sort of keep the same set of beliefs and practices you've had before and use that data to continue to think about the way you've been doing things in a way. So you might strengthen a particular program that you have or shift a program to a different grade level. You're not really changing much of your thinking around these issues. In double loop learning, the idea is that you would come together and you would question some of the assumptions you've made about that program. You might think about looking at different types of data than you've looked at before. So this process of then using it to reflect upon and change your practices and have them evolve as a group and sort of this iterative process that happens, we don't see that many places. And I think partially this has to do with the fact that those underlying relationships aren't built that allow that to happen. So our three themes come together in the book across these chapters, but we also have 5 cross-themes that we want to share with you today, and then the implications that we believe are important to think about as a result. So the first one is that there are a lot of types of evidence used, whether policymakers are accessing different types of evidence or school leaders are. The issue that we find is that they're used sporadically because of pressures that happen with timing and decision making, and also because there's not access to certain types of information and it's not always valued. And that can lead to a disconnect between the research that exists and the use of it on the ground. Also, as suggested, if there are relationships that are brokering this information, it's like a little bit like the game of telephone. And so you can have groups that are actually filtering along the way, which is good in many ways, but it also can lead to certain ways of thinking about that evidence that exists. So it rests upon, if we have too few people sharing the ideas and practices, then that can limit the understanding of them.
So the other thing that comes out as you look across these chapters is this idea about research evidence being used as a frame. And this is really fascinating because on any number of occasions people will say research says and then sort of launch into some diatribe about what they believe. I've used this on a couple of occasions with all the studies around red wine, suggesting that one more glass of red wine certainly is good for me, so have at it. So a bottle must be twice as good, right? So people use research in a way to sort of frame what's happening. And often they'll do that that's aligned to their own beliefs and values, right? And that can actually set us down very different paths depending on how the research is framed. But what we're really arguing here, and what you see across these chapters, and I think what you're seeing in this growing body of work, is that evidence is just part of the process. It's one of the magical ingredients that enables reform and improvement and change to actually take place. And so if we think about this as learning and as a process and as our connectedness, we're more likely to see this improvement happen. The other part that's really important here is this idea about the reciprocated relationships between practice and theory. Okay? And, you know, for a lot of time we have been really concerned about the rigor of our work, and that's really important. But we've been less mindful about the relevance of our work. So I think in this next stage, as we come forward together into this bright new day filled with red wine, we want to be mindful of both the rigor of our work and the relevance, the connectedness. And it's also an understanding that knowledge exists in multiple locations. No longer does the university on the hill hold all the knowledge. It exists in multiple places. And so now the question becomes, how do we create those reciprocated relationships grounded in trust and understanding that can really make a difference? And as I mentioned before, and as we really feel very strongly in our work, and we just completed a study about this, which we'll tell you a little bit later when we push on this idea about reciprocated relationships in a second, is that the quality and the type of relationships that we really have are really important. So if we can build and create the conditions for deep, trusting relationships to occur, then we're more likely to take a chance with one another. So for example, if Karen and I have a deep, trusting relationship, which we do, I'm more likely to try things out and to be vulnerable with her, right? I'm more likely to experiment, to risk take, in a way that I know I'm safe with her. So what happens often is that people don't feel psychologically safe in the environments in which they do their work. And that's in part because of sanctions and fear and the pressure that Kara talked about at the beginning. So one question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we create the conditions for deep, trusting relationships to be part of our work? How do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with one another, to be open, to be human with one another in doing our important work?
Okay, so given all of these ideas, we think, of course, it's important to think about what does that mean for policy and practice right now? What are the next steps? The first one that is, I think, very clear throughout the book is this idea of capacity building has to happen for these kinds of relationships to take place, for people to understand both what kinds of evidence they're looking at, but also to have those connections to be able to make sense of them together. And right now in our system that's much more focused on compliance and accountability, there's not a lot of room for that to happen. So really a shift in how we think about building capacity at all levels of the system in the context of this accountability is really critical right now. Also, incentivizing collaborative work across the system. And so what we mean by that is there are examples that we have of how these partnerships exist, particularly around higher ed and district leaders, for example. And those are great, but they're few and far between. And one of the things that AERA, American Educational Research Association, is starting to push on is this idea. How do we make sure that these kinds of connections are happening? How can we develop a culture that allows researchers to understand that that's part of their practice, that might not have been their orientation before. But this also means building relationships on the ground. How do policymakers connect more with district leaders to understand what's happening on the ground as policy is playing out? And I'm from New York State, and so we have a lot of challenges right now in that, where there's just not a lot of understanding of what's going on the ground that could inform policy and actually make it work much better. So as Alan suggested, this reciprocated relationships is critical. This is hard to do, though, because it does involve the change in our paradigm in terms of how we understand what we're learning from each other. So even though Alan and I have now been working together for 8 or 9 years, that's easy. You start to develop this kind of relationship. It doesn't happen right away. And there's a lot of distrust in the system. And that's part of the problem. Whether we're work in schools or in district central office, there's so much change that has to happen in terms of making people trust each other. That's going to be the starting point before they can actually sit down and look at evidence and say, okay, how can we make this better? So having ways that we actually incentivize this kind of building trust is hard. We have to figure out how to do it. And we also have to work on developing leaders who know how to do this in their systems, whether it's policy leaders or leaders on the ground in districts and in schools.
I think the other important part here is that we also have to be mindful that this suggests a completely different set of capacities that we have to be intentional about. So it's one thing to sort of say, okay, on Wednesday you're the second grade, but on Thursday you're a professional learning community, go, right? There are a host of skills and capacities necessary. Some of those are those technical elements. So please don't misinterpret that we're saying ignore the technical, only pay attention to the relational. We're not saying that. We're saying it's really critical to have the technical knowledge and skills. And you need the social capital, the social interactions to really make that happen. So it's both and. In education, I spent 16 years in public school practice before going to the university. So I lived in the world of public school practice. And I ducked my head as the phonics and the whole language debate took place. I ducked my head when we went from cooperative learning to individualized instruction, right? Because educators are like, this too will pass. Because this too will pass. So the question becomes, how do we move beyond these kind of separated either-or work and to try to think about work as both and. It's both the technical skills and it's the social capacities that are necessary. And I think this also likely suggests something different at the university level. As an academic, I don't think this is true for you either, and no disrespect to our institutions, they were wonderful, but as an academic, I wasn't trained in how to play well with others out in the field. I knew how to do that because I came from the world of practice. But that isn't the natural orientation, right? So how are we mindful at higher education about also building the capacities about the next generation of academics that are going to come out to do this work? How do we grow them up understanding that just the way that we do things is exactly as that story that Vivian shared at the very beginning? And more importantly, how do we help universities incentivize that kind of work when they often spend most of their time counting how many publications you have and where those publications take place?
And the one thing I'll add is that some of the greatest learning that Ellen and I have done is when we bring those charts and maps to the schools and the central office and say, what do you see? And then they start a conversation about what they see on those pictures that he was showing before. And that helps us to understand, because a lot of times we as researchers, of course, make assumptions about what we're seeing and what's going on in these places. Without that insider knowledge, we would be stuck at a certain place. But having that insider knowledge from them as they grapple with it allows us to then think differently about our own work. And I think that's one of the, back to the training, is we're not oriented to think that way necessarily in the training that we've had. And so it's developing a different type of skill.
I think this is such an important point here, because one of the things that we're really intentional about doing in our work is that the impulse is to come in and collect this data and give a list of recommendations. In fact, people readily ask us for this, like, tell us what to do, right? But the trick is to hold the sacred space to say, we're not going to do that. We're going to respect and honor your intelligence and your thoughtfulness, and we together are going to learn what this means, and we together will figure out what you're supposed to do with it. And holding that space, and I call it sacred space intentionally, because that is where the learning happens. That's the magic sauce, I think. And this is what I think accounts for what Vivian was talking about in Paul's work. It's that space that you can hold in which people can professionally develop, learn, grow, and create these kind of relationships we know are consequential for the work.
So as a result of that, we've developed new norms of reciprocal exchange. And we have done that in our own work, as we're suggesting, because we've developed that trusting relationship where they don't think we're coming in to give them all the answers. They understand that the research evidence that we bring is what we gathered from surveys and interviews and things from their community, but we're only part of the story. They're part of the story too. And so we've been able to develop this reciprocal exchange of ideas and practices, and that's hard. It's hard to develop that, and it's time-consuming. And as Alan's suggesting, that even though it's so critical, we don't tend to think about that piece when we're thinking about the work that we do. We also don't think about, not just the practice of doing that, but the idea that this is a goal we should have for the future, for leaders in higher ed, for leaders in different levels of the system. And so if that's our goal, then how do we think about the way that we prepare people? We have to then put it into place, whether it's in coursework or experiences or shadowing, whether it's in the mentoring that happens at the university level. And all of those things have to be supported by our policies and our structures that exist.
So the idea is, how do we bring together our human capital, right? Our knowledge, experiences, understanding, training, and our social capital, the power in our relationships, to actually generate this idea around intellectual capital, something that didn't exist before, right? Something that pushes our boundaries, something that creates opportunities for double loop learning to actually take place. And as we sort of bring this, all these big ideas with no charts and graphs to a close, let's just tap on a couple other things. So one of the things that's really wonderful about this partnership is that I've gotten to know Kara both as a person, as a professional, and as a fellow academic that's really passionate about the work. That's been really great for me personally. The other thing is that she's been influenced by some of my strange Californian ways. Hence, we have a slide up here with somebody doing yoga in the middle of this very peaceful lake. So you may be thinking to yourself, what could this possibly have to do with research evidence? We thought the same thing, but we just thought it was such a great image that we wanted to use it. And what we really came upon is it's this idea about being mindful and intentional about our work. This idea about mindfulness and compassion is really starting to come to the fore. At UC San Diego, we have a Center for Mindfulness. Stanford's got a Center for Mindfulness. This idea about being mindful, present, and intentional is incredibly important. Our work has really been a lot around leadership and also teachers, but the role of leadership in being mindful and intentional about their work is really important. And so as we look at developing and generating new policies, which will be something that we have to do, that's really important. But can we also be mindful and intentional about tweaking existing policies that don't undercut the opportunities for people to build relationships, to try stuff, to fail fast, to fail forward, and to redo and to redesign their own workplaces? How are we intentional and mindful about that? So in bringing this to close, we sort of selected this series of images. And does anyone have any idea what this is an image of, by the way? That sounds rhetorical, but if you have an idea and you want to shout it out, I can't give you a book if you guess it right. Huh? Holy? Ah, right, okay. So it is a kind of a festival. Actually, what you're looking at here, I just came back from a Fulbright in Barcelona. So I always pick difficult places to travel to. So I came back from a Fulbright in Barcelona. And outside Barcelona, little villages, they have these big festivals, you're absolutely right, and they build these things called human castles, which are really awesome. I'm going to show you one of those in a second. But as Kara and I were really thinking about this work, I kept pestering her. I'm like, oh, these things from Barcelona are so cool. We got to see how this is, because I think it's a metaphor for what we really believe in and what comes out across the chapters. So the first thing is we've got to think about this festival as human castle attempt as a system, as an interdependent and interconnected system. Let me make that more sort of concrete. So this is the foundation of one of these human castles. And what you see here is you see the connections and everyone's arms connecting with everybody else. And you cannot tell in that foundation who is the mayor, who is collecting the garbage, who's the teacher, who's the doctor. At that point in time, we all are connected and all have a common purpose. It takes about 700 people to make one of these castles. It'll be the big reveal in a moment. This is just the warm-up. It takes about 700 people to make one of these castles. And I interviewed some of the students that I was working with when I was on my visit, and I asked them, I said, okay, but is there really an important person in this? Like, where's the kind of keystone in this? And that to them was a completely crazy question, because there is no one keystone. The hands on my shoulders of somebody in front of me are just as important as the hands that are on my shoulders that are supporting me. Because when we think about this, this is about engendering cooperation among many, among us all, towards a common shared purpose. And when you can do that, you can do amazing things. This is one of these castles completed. So at the very end, what happens is a 4-year-old boy scampers up this sort of, this group of people, right? He scampers up this. This is all any parents in the audience would have some level of freak out about this, I'm sure. But he scampers up. At the very end, he holds up 4 fingers, which represents the flag of the area. And it's a big, huge honor to be that kid. But I also asked the question, I'm like, okay, I'm afraid of heights. So like, what if I'm that kid and I freak? And I'm like really nervous and I freak out. Well, they have spare kids that are also ready to go, right? So in other words, there's redundancy in the system. We aren't solely responsible for one person, and when that person goes, oh well. There's redundancy in the system. And if that little boy or girl can't climb that tower and because they get too nervous or whatever, they're still part of the team, right? So even when we trip and we fall, we are still part of the team. So how do we create the conditions for that to really happen? How are we interconnected and interdependent in a deep system of trust and meaning and mindfulness to accomplish great things? At the end of the day, we're talking about research evidence, but really on a deeper level, we're talking about our ability to work and to be together and to push ourselves to places we didn't think were possible. And the moment we think our book would suggest is right now to do that work. So with that, we will say thank you. And Maria wanted to know if anyone wanted to volunteer to build a little castle up here. We're also